We're live.
Hello, we are here with Between Past and Future with your host Ethan and Rajdeep. Today we're going to be talking to Roger Berkowitz. Roger Berkowitz is the founder of and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities and professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. Professor Berkowitz authored The Gift of Science, Leibniz in Modern Legal Tradition. Berkowitz is the co-editor of Thinking in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt on Ethics and Politics, the Intellectual Origins of the Global Financial Crisis, and Artifacts of Thinking, reading Hannah Arendt's Denktagebuch. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the American Interest, Book Forum, The Forward, the Paris Review Online, Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and many other publications. Berkowitz edits and contributes to the weekly newsletter Amor Mundi. He is the winner of the 2019 Hannah Arendt Prize for political thought given by the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Bremen, Germany. Rajdeep and I know Roger from time at Bard College. I took several classes with him, and they were all very interesting and illuminating. We also were big fans of the Hannah Arendt conference. I attended pretty sure most years I was there, saw most of the speakers, ton of great speakers, people I'd never even heard of before. And today we wanted to talk to Roger about several things. The first one was Harper's letter. He was the signatory on. And so, Roger, if you just want to briefly introduce yourself maybe and talk about why you decided to sign the letter, or even perhaps who first talked to you about the letter.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ethan and Rajdeep. It's good to see you guys again. It's been a couple of years. So yeah, as Ethan said, I run the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and the Arendt Center is sort of dedicated to bringing to bringing speakers and ideas to campus that are bold and provocative, very much in the spirit of Hannah Arendt. One of the things that I most love about Hannah Arendt is that when you read her, whether it's on education or it's on desegregation or it's on totalitarianism or loneliness, you don't know what she's going to say ahead of time. She's an unpredictable thinker, and the reason is because she thinks originally and uniquely about each particular issue. In the end, once you hear what she has to say, you can often make sense of it within the context of her thinking. But she's not in any way a doctrinaire or orthodox thinker, and I've always loved that about her. She believed deeply that if you want to understand totalitarianism, you need to read Nazis, and you need to listen to Nazis, and you need to understand what they're saying, and that's the only way that you can actually learn to understand and then resist totalitarianism, is if you actually understand it. And so for her, the world is a very complicated place. People are different. Agreement is the exception. It's not the rule. And so if you want to understand the world, you actually have to hear other opinions. And this is part of her idea of plurality, that the world is full of unique people who disagree. And politics is not about truth. There is no truth in politics, she says repeatedly. And the idea that in politics we're supposed to talk about what's true and what's false and exclude what's false is just, for her, nonsense. Yeah, there are facts, and we should worry about people who try to deceive us or create deception about what the facts are. But on the opinions, we need to hear a wide range, listen to people we disagree with, and that's the only way we can begin to understand the world and its plurality and its perplexity. At the Arendt Center, I bring a lot of people from very different perspectives to our conferences, to our events. I'm at a liberal college, which both of you know. I would say most of the speakers we bring are on the liberal end, some very liberal and off the spectrum, or much more liberal than the campus even, but most are liberal. But we've also brought some conservatives, and we bring people who have, we think, fairly wide perspectives. And I've certainly gotten some pushback from that over the years, as you two of you know. And yet in the last year or two, the situation, not only on campuses, but at corporations, be it Google or the New York Times, is getting worse. The unwillingness of certain people to hear ideas they disagree with, the desire to deplatform, to provide, to not allow ideas to have a voice, has become extreme in our society. To the extent that, now in the last few months, whether it's the New York Times firing 2 editors for publishing an op-ed by a sitting U.S. senator, or whether it's a publication firing somebody for tweeting a peer-reviewed article about the impact that violence has on political voting patterns in protests, or whether it's a San Diego utility company firing an employee because he had his hand out the window and someone thought he was making a white supremacy sign. These kind of group assassination over Twitter and social media, where people are, in a sense, excluded because of either who they're with or who they are associated with, or some idea that what they've said is out of bounds, does strike me as demonstrating that we've reached a point where many people are simply unwilling to hear or listen to viewpoints that they find objectionable. And this is creating a real problem in a pluralistic democracy. And so the letter, I think, starts there, if you want to, and that's the basic problem that I see. By the way, it starts also with the fact that we have the president who, whenever somebody does something he doesn't like, tries to cancel them, whether it's Anthony Vidman or Anthony Fauci. He is just as bad and just as much part of the cancel culture as people at Google or as at universities, as far as I'm concerned. You have a widespread view on the left and the right around the world that liberalism, which is a weird term and who knows what it means, but for now I'll use it as a stand-in for the idea that we should live in a pluralistic world in which we listen to and hear opinions different from our own, is out of vogue and is no longer meaningful today. And so, I think it's just, I want to say that the letter in Harper's never mentions the left. It talks about liberalism, illiberalism rising on both sides of the political spectrum, and suggests that there is a real problem on both amongst populist right and, to some extent, a kind of woke liberal left or anti-liberal left that has rejected the idea of a pluralistic liberal society.
I think so. In terms of looking at this in a left-right continuum, I think that's particularly unuseful because it really goes much deeper than just I don't like your opinion because it goes against my political opinion. It seems almost that people are saying that differing opinions are dangerous, and so people on the right are sometimes saying, oh, this person, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that someone is a child abuser or is in some way a danger to children, so they need to be silenced or locked up, or someone is, for example, there was a young girl on the internet who made a joke about all lives matter and Black Lives Matter. She said, if you say all lives matter, I'm going to stab you and then show you my paper cut and say, look, all cuts matter. So she wasn't saying that she's going to stab anyone. This was just an exaggerated joke. And the right immediately went on Twitter, got her fired, etc. And on the left, people are saying certain opinions, like J.K. Rowling's, are actually dangerous to trans people and to various other minorities. I think that's kind of what I got from the letter, was that there seems to be a danger rising in cutting off certain opinions as being not useful, not worth hearing. And even if they might be dangerous, it's not to say that they couldn't possibly be dangerous. I think Arendt would say that's precisely the ones we need to listen to the most. So if you just ignore them and shut them away, you can't actually understand what they're talking about. And then in the realm of politics, which isn't about just factual correctness, you're going to end up losing. If you just say, oh, well, they're factually wrong, and you haven't done the work of actually persuading someone.
Yeah, I think we have to look also at the context, right? So I teach at a college, both of you went to. I'm an academic of sorts, and I think as an academic, my job is to try and understand the world and teach my students to understand the world as well. And as a result, I have an obligation to teach them the plurality and perplexity and complicated nature of that world. That to me strikes me as deeply important in an academic environment. Um, you know, if I'm a politician, I may have different obligations. I want to win. Now, I hope that's not my only obligation as a politician, because I also want to care about the common good of the country. Um, and yet today, winning seems to be the only concern for many of these politicians. Um, but there may be times in which, as a politician or as a political figure, you're ready to say, look, while we want to hear wide ranges of views, there are certain views from raging racists or anti-Semites or whatever it is that we're not willing to hear, right? That it's better that we actually protect people from. Now, the problem with that is that if you suppress those views and you do so, legally or violently, the chances are you simply, you know, push them underground and you create resentments and you don't actually solve the problem. But I can understand people saying, look, there are things that we just shouldn't be saying in public, in a political sphere. Um, I think it's a complicated issue, and we should have that discussion. Uh, I don't think that's the case in an academic environment. I think in an academic environment, we actually have an obligation to hear a lot more than we do in the public sphere. But then there's the question of what is really dangerous. I mean, is it really dangerous to hear what a senator says about protests? Is it really dangerous to hear what J.K. Rowling says about feminism? Um, I think one of the things we're seeing is an over is a is a is a is a is a is a rise in the sense that opinions are dangerous. And there's, I think, different arguments for that. One is a sort of a modern use of the word trauma, which is that certain opinions can traumatize people, which I think is a misuse of the term trauma, but I mean it's becoming widely used. And then the second is that these opinions. So take, for example, Tom Cotton saying in the New York Times that the federal government should come in and suppress the protests. What some people want to say is that that's dangerous because if it justifies police violence, it will lead to deaths and it will lead to injuries, primarily to black and brown people, but to potentially anyone who's protesting. Or if J.K. Rowling says that there are certain that we have to be able to talk about women having vaginas and having periods or menstruating, and people say, well, that makes it seem like trans women are not full women with the rights of women, and that's going to lead to discrimination against trans women. Again, both of these claims may be right, and there may be some there's power in words, and we have to take these seriously. But you have to weigh that against the consideration of that we actually listen to people we disagree with and not simply shut them up, but learn how to argue with them and persuade them. Otherwise, you can't live in a liberal society.
So I guess one of the questions that I have then, and one of the concerns I have, is that we particularly, maybe this is a nationwide problem, it might be a generation problem. What is the role of politics? If Arendt says it's not the realm of truth seeking, that's probably something that's probably the duty of the philosopher, Arendt would say, I would imagine, or the academic. If politics isn't for truth seeking, what is it for? I've also, talking to people about Ethan and I's age, I have one friend who claims that we should be framing more and more political issues as if they are moral issues, because that's the way to energize people and get behind them. But that too doesn't seem, as far as I could tell, that doesn't seem like it would align much with what Arendt would have to say about the role of politics.
No, I mean, certainly politics is not a moral issue for her. Politics is about freedom for Hannah Arendt, right? Politics is about the freedom to act together with others to do things in the world, to do things, to say and act in ways that people will remember, to do great things. And so freedom is the freedom to act, and politics is about freedom. And it's based in plurality. It's based in the idea that we're all in some way equal, that we can all talk to each other and hear each other, but also that we're all different. And politics is the forming through speaking and acting of a common world. In those common worlds, there will be, if they are formed, there will be agreements that we come to that are almost like truths, and yet they're not truth in any metaphysical sense. They're things that are widely accepted, but those truths can change and at times break down. And when that happens, politics becomes quite unruly. And until some new foundation is possible, politics becomes quite much of a combat sport. Arendt, basically thinks that in politics, we have to respect enough the fact of our plurality and our difference that we try and persuade people. We try and speak and act in ways that show them the truth, the sense of what we're saying. And if we succeed, we create sort of a foundation. And if we don't, we then have a decision to make. Can we live together with these people and disagree about these issues? And in her view, one of the important parts of politics is that you have to make space for groups of people to live next to each other who disagree about important issues. And the only way to do that is to find those lowest common denominator fundamental issues that they agree upon that unite them as a people. So what is it that we share, right? As whatever it is, Americans, Germans, New Yorkers, Californians, what is it we share that makes us a people? And what are we allowed to disagree about that makes us plural and different? And how much disagreement, plurality, can we allow within that common shared common world? And that's the kind of question that Arendt sees as at the core of politics.
So with
that seems. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So with the comment you made about freedom to act together, freedom to be remembered, to make great things happen in history, Arendt talked about revolution and specifically looked at the French and the American Revolution. And one thing she said about the French Revolution was, paraphrasing, that they got their bread and were forgotten, something along those lines, and that the French Revolution failed partially because it focused too much on getting bread and getting things, objects that they wanted, instead of the American Revolution, which laid that groundwork and frame for politics to happen, and a continuation of citizen participation in politics. If there is some sort of revolution going on today, do you think it tends more towards that French Revolution style that Arendt was talking about, or the American revolutionary style that ended up, in her view at least, for a period of time, made those groundworkings possible for politics to happen?
Yes, it's a big question. Arendt looks at the American and French revolutions and sees them very differently. One of the main differences is one you're alluding to, Ethan, that the American Revolution, she says, sought to and in some way created a foundation or constituted freedom, public freedom. Whereas she thinks the French Revolution did not successfully do that. What does she mean? She means that in the French Revolution, there was too much of a concern with, as you said, providing people with necessities and seeing all the people as part of one French nation that would speak in unison. And anyone who spoke outside of that, obviously, there was a problem in the French Revolution with the terror as it emerged. But the idea that there would be a nation, a French nation, that would have a very strong national identity. Arendt thought that one of the great lucky advantages of the American Revolution is that there was no attempt to make America into a nation state, that America was not a nation. You had 13 colonies, and even within them, you had many different groups. And it was an attempt to say, look, there's going to be a national government that's going to have power, more power than the Articles of Confederation did earlier on. But there's also going to be 13 states, and they're going to have powers. And then there's going to be counties and local governments, and they're going to have powers. And what she saw is that there was no sort of in her mind American idea, so that politics became a struggle of New York and Massachusetts against Virginia and Georgia, and that people would argue, and people would in some sense say, look, where we can agree, we agree, and where we don't agree, we do things differently. And this was for her. Now, I want to just point out, for her, slavery was the great evil, and she calls it the great original sin. She didn't think that should be exempted, and we could talk about why. But she does think that politics is about letting people come forth and argue and pursue their interests and engage in public debate around the issues of the day. And it's not simply about providing people with administration, housing, food, health, etc. It's not that those things are unimportant. It's that for her, in order to get them, you have to engage and act politically, freely, participate in the public world. And that was what she loved about the American Revolution at the time. Obviously, she thinks that part of the American Revolution has been lost, and America has largely became a nation state in the mid-20th century, became a centralized state, and lost that treasure of its freedom that she thought had emerged at its foundation.
Yeah, I think that that makes a lot of sense, especially with the calls. I've seen this mostly on the progressive left. The idea to abolish the electoral college system, that seems to fly in the face of exactly the sort of dynamic that Arendt was praising about sort of people disagreeing and states sort of combating each other for certain federal policies and things like that.
Well, I mean, the Electoral College, was there's a lot of aspects of the Electoral College. One is the attempt to balance rural and urban centers in the country. So the Electoral College was an attempt to guarantee that even smaller states and more rural states would still have some power, both in the Senate and in the election of the president. Then there's the second part of the Electoral College, which was that you would vote for electors, not directly for the president, because there was a distrust of democracy, and there was almost a desire for a failsafe that these electors would be elite people who, if the people voted for, a crazy, narcissistic, warish person who tweets all the time, could decide to throw their vote not for him after the election. Those are two very different parts of the Electoral College. They were both seen as important at the founding. Certainly, the second part today is widely discredited because we live in a much more democratic age than the founders did, and there's a real fear of electors not voting for the candidate that they were selected to vote for. On the rural-urban divide, I think there's a good, that's a more complicated argument. I'm not sure the Electoral College has. Arendt, as far as I know, never wrote about the Electoral College, or if she did, it was an offhand comment. I don't think she has much to say about it. I think the bigger issue from her point of view is federalism. She did believe that one of the greatest and the most important constitutional innovations of the United States was the dispersion of powers. The fact that there was no one central power structure in the United States. Yes, there was a federal government, but there was also the states, and they would exist in conflict. And there was the president, the Congress, and the courts, and they would exist in conflict. And there were counties, and there were local governments. And she thought that this multiplication and dispersion of powers was the key to preserving freedom. In her view, no constitution could preserve rights or freedom. The only way to preserve freedom is to disperse powers, so that if one branch of government or one state or one federal government took too much power, other groups could unite to resist it and oppose it. And that was, to her, the secret sauce, or one of the secret sauces of the American sort of constitution of a free and constitutional democracy.
So one thing I see today in regards to the unrest, some people are calling it the Great Reckoning or Great Awakening, New Great Awakening events, basically after George Floyd. It's hard to make one sort of group assessment because all over the country there's very different things happening. Some of the events resemble parades more than they do protest. Some of them in Portland have gotten extremely violent. In New York City, I actually know someone who's a firefighter, and he told me going around putting out fires, he's seen polar opposites. Some people are starting the fires, other people are trying to stop them, trying to put out the fires. But I do see a kind of general consensus that there isn't time for talk. There needs to be action. One popular phrase is white silence is violence. So it's not as though people are endorsing violence, but they're basically saying by whatever means necessary. And I do see a lot of things where people are, for example, in the park near me in Brooklyn, they have an open mic night where people do poetry. It isn't really open mic. They have a couple people selected, but there are some things that generally do seem to be discussion-based and talking about moving forward, building common ground. But I do see widespread violence and in some cases terror, people throwing Molotov cocktails, people throwing fireworks and bombs at courthouses. Do you think that's an accurate assumption? Is there a possibility that you can have sort of this very direct, maybe not, some people say it's not violence if it's directed towards buildings and not people. I would happen to disagree. But do you think that this sort of action indicates it has more in common with the French Revolution? They're using terror, or is that some people would say this is propaganda and that it's generally peaceful, that people are generally moving in the right direction?
Well, there's a lot of different parts to your question, Ethan. On the question of violence, I think I would never say that violence is never justified, but I think violence usually is counterproductive. I think that most of the time, when protests turn violent, most of the time, the protest movement is hurt by it rather than helped by it. And so from a strategic point of view, someone who is in favor of making real change, I think you would keep the protest from turning too violent. That said, violence can at times be a way for people who don't have a voice or don't have the ability to impact the political conversation to draw attention to the real injustices that are happening, that are being ignored by people who are able to ignore them. And I think that's that line between violence needed to make injustices visible and violence which leads to more violence and thus leads to a betrayal of the effort to make the world more just, is the line that I think many protest movements have to tread. You need to do certain things to get people's attention, right? I think the fact that, when protest groups shut down roads or, block highways, these are efforts to shout in ways that it's very hard to be heard in a modern society. And so I think you have to walk this line. You want to do enough to make the justice and the extent of the injustice visible. And you don't want to do so much that you turn potential allies against you because they think, oh my God, these people are going to burn down the world, and I don't want the world to be burned down. So on the question of violence, to me, violence is a means. It's a means to an end. And those who have studied violence have generally showed that when protest movements or revolutionary movements become too violent, they lose power. With some exceptions, sometimes you need the violence, but most of the time it doesn't work, and so it's a tactical issue. That's to the violence part of your question, as far as I understand it. On the revolution question, I will say that the last 7 years have seen a revolution, at least in public opinion, on the question of the continued institutional racism in this country. 7 years ago, when you had Trayvon Martin and others, and Eric Garner being killed, the Black Lives Matter movement started. And, I think I, like a lot of others, thought, yeah, we should say Black Lives Matter, but, I don't think I appreciated the daily affront and the daily difficulty that many African Americans, especially Black men, faced in the country. And over 7 years of the Black Lives Matter protests leading to George Floyd, you've seen white opinion in this country shift radically from under 50% to over 70%, believing that systematic racism is a real problem in this country. And
It's
I
no
think
higher among white liberals now rate racism as more of a problem than Black people overall do, according to polls.
okay, well, racism is a different thing. But what I'm saying is I think white liberals now understand in a way they didn't that that the police and other institutions really do treat Black people differently. We can get into arguments about different facts. Are more Black people killed per capita by the police than white people? It's complicated. The numbers are different. But the numbers are not different on the question of whether Black people are harassed by the police and arrested by the police and patted down by the police more than white people. I mean, it's astronomical. And I think over time, you've seen a revolution in opinion. The question then is, how do you move from that revolution in opinion to making changes in policy and in the lives of people? And I think that's a really important next step. And I think there's no right answer to that. I mean, I think that's the work that has to be done. You need to change some laws. You need to reconstitute police forces. You need to rethink the way police forces interact with people. I find the words defund the police very a bit blunt. Just like I'll admit, 7 years ago, I found the word Black Lives Matter, again, not wrong, but a bit blunt. And, I've changed my opinion on Black Lives Matter over 7 years. I don't know where I'll come to. I don't think I'll ever say we should completely defund the police. I think I just don't believe in that. But I think the instinct of it, or what I think it's meant by it, which is that we need to rethink the role of police in our society. That I fundamentally believe in, and I've thought that for many years. I mean, the police are wildly too armed in our country. They have too many tanks and armored vehicles and big weapons. They carry too many guns. I just think that we do policing wrong, and I think that affects white people and Black people more than white people. So yeah, I mean, I think that we are in a revolution right now. I think there's a revolutionary change in opinion going on. We're in a revolutionary moment right now. There's a revolutionary change in opinion. But what I think doesn't yet exist is a good sense of what should replace what we have now. I think there's a very strong agreement forming that there is a problem. But there's not yet a sense of what the future solution is. And, Hannah Arendt used to say there's in a revolutionary situation is when the old order has lost its legitimacy. And I think that for many people, the police and certain institutions have lost their legitimacy today. But she says there's no guarantee that a revolutionary situation turns into a revolution. And what turns it into a revolution is not violence, not war, but she says revolutionaries who actually have a new idea, who actually have an idea for the future that can inspire people to agree with them. And what I find lacking amongst the people who are proposing a revolution along the lines of the Black Lives Matter movement or the anti-racism movement is I find lacking an idea that can appeal to a wide range of the population and inspire them to come together around a new way of thinking. Just to give, I said defund the police. I think defund the police is too blunt an idea. Another idea, something like Ibram Kendi, who I had speak at Bard last year, his idea that all policies are either racist or anti-racist, I think is way too blunt a statement. And his idea that we should have agencies in governments and in schools that say that each law or regulation and each professor or each person in government is either a racist or anti-racist. Again, way too blunt. These are not ideas that I think bring us to a revolution, because I think they're not going to be accepted by the majority of people, rightly, in my view. So, so what we need is people who are willing to actually do the hard work of trying to articulate a new vision of what, I think for a long time, the vision of anti-racism was colorblindness. Don't judge me by the color of my skin, but by the content of my character. And what we're really encountering right now is an entire movement and generation of people saying that is not the right way to deal with racism. We need to take the fact that colorblindness doesn't work. Now, are they right? I don't know, right? We can have that argument. But there's a lot of people who think that. And then there's some people who think we should get rid of race, like my friend Thomas Chatterton Williams, who helped sign the Harper's letter. And they think that race is an imaginary thing, which I think is also true, and that we shouldn't re-race the world. And the point is, there's actually huge arguments between people of all races and all colors right now about what our future vision on race is. Should it be colorblindness? Should it be overcoming race? Should it be reasserting race? And I think there's a huge disagreement. And so we're in this period where the old ideal, right, which was colorblindness, overcoming racism, is in a sense no longer widely accepted or unproblematically accepted. We don't know what the future ideal is. That's where we're at. And what we need to do now is actually have honest, disagreeable, contentious, thoughtful, persuasive debates where people argue about it. And it might take generations. But my view is that if people talk honestly and get their opinions out in ways that are uncomfortable, over time, we'll come to new agreements. Well, over time, we'll come to new shared understandings. I don't know what those will be. But that's why, to come back to the Harper's letter, that's why it's so important to have open and vigorous discourse. Because the best way to pursue justice is to talk about our differences. And in talking about them, we'll start to persuade you a little bit, me a little bit. We'll meet here, we'll meet there. And over time, a new agreement, a new reality, a new common understanding can emerge. And I believe that.
This is kind of a little bit about what worries me and scares me about the movement. Is that on the first, when Black Lives Matter first came around, I don't remember how old, 2013, so I would have been about 16, 17, 18. And to me, it was not a new fact that, racism existed or that the police were biased against African Americans largely. I grew up watching things like The Chappelle Show, where they joked about this a lot. Various shows like, what am I thinking of? Raj, what was the name of the, Everybody Hates Chris. It's a show based on Chris Rock's childhood. And I also went to a school that was fairly diverse. But there was a newness of this conversation where they're talking specifically about police shooting people. There was evidence on video, similar to what happened with Rodney King, where it galvanized people. And it was clear to me that there was movement towards something that had been talked about for 20, 30 years. People were actually starting to address it publicly. White people were starting to believe it. More conservative white people were finally looking at it. And now, today, you have a massive shift, like you're talking about, where vast numbers of white people who are completely uncritical of the police, of Fox News, for example, are now starting to question those things. But amongst the progressive left and people my age, I see the opposite of conversations. People, and I don't think they're doing this on purpose or out of meanness or a desire for chaos, but they actually feel that things are so dire that there needs to be action and the time for talk is over, that the facts are just there. If you have Google, you can go Google it. What people say a lot of times is if you ask people of color to explain racism, you need to pay them for their emotional labor, because this is something that's just so obvious, no one should be explaining it to you. So when it gets down to this thing where we want to reform police and we see that racism is a problem, And there's hard evidence, like Roland Fryer in his study about policing, he said, look, there's evidence that black people are being beaten up, pushed on the ground, ticketed more often than white people. If most people agree about this, and there's an opportunity, a window for us to take action, it kind of seems like it's being sabotaged by younger people on the left who want to keep taking it further, and don't want to stop and have thoughtful conversations. So it has to be defund the police or nothing. It has to be take $1 billion away from the police or nothing. And I don't even think this is connected to Black Lives Matter as a movement, especially because it's sort of it's not one organization it has various different chapters. People are just sharing the hashtag. Anyone can be part of Black Lives Matter if they agree with it. But specifically among college-educated younger people, I see a lack of concern or desire for conversation, and that really worries me, especially in relation to stuff like this letter.
Yeah, seeing things that are happening in Seattle with Chaz Chop, the attack on the federal courthouse in Portland. And this is something Ethan and I have talked about. And that is a lot of these people who are participating in this, although they may have real political concerns about how policing is done, there is concern, particularly on my part, that a lot of these people are rootless and isolated. And that worries me.
Lonely.
Yeah, they're lonely people. And the fact that they are able to shout down other people when they start taking violent action, and the progressive left has done an amazing job in one sense to shift the Overton window about what conversations we're having in this country in terms of policy nationally. And they've been doing it at a dramatic rate. So, yeah, I think there's a real concern. One of our YouTube listeners, he's started reading Origins of Totalitarianism again, he said, because he's worried about sort of the totalitarian sort of shadow that's lurking behind a lot of this stuff. I think there's a real fear about that kind of peeking out in this moment right now.
I don't know if necessarily, I don't know if coincidence is the right word, but with coronavirus and COVID, you suddenly atomized society and told people to stay home, and a lot of people were very lonely. Even if you have the luck to be with family or to travel a little, almost everyone was broken out of their routine, going to work, going to bars, seeing friends. And so at a moment where there's massive loneliness and atomization going on, it seems like regardless of how good people's intentions are or how correct they are and what's wrong, what the problem is, maybe it's almost impossible sometimes for people to have conversations. There doesn't seem to be much common ground. When I meet someone who I disagree with, even friends, good friends who I disagree with about this stuff, there just isn't a conversation. It's just more of sniping at each other quickly and not wanting to talk. Well, I'm usually excited to talk about things, but most of the time when something like Black Lives Matter comes up, or policing, or even depending on the group of people I'm with, gun control, there's a desire to just state your opinion and shut up. I'm right, you're wrong, don't talk about it. And when you try to talk about it, it just descends into arguing where people seem to be talking past each other. There doesn't seem to be a common ground of what you can work towards.
And the loneliness issue, I don't know if this is still the case, but early on with the corona shutdown, particularly in California, in San Francisco specifically, the suicide rate outpaced the death by coronavirus rate. People are not well in I wouldn't say everyone, but there's a real issue that's related to mental health and sort of lack of community.
Yeah. So, again, there's a number of issues floating around here. The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was Arendt's first big book that made her famous, doesn't try and offer a causal history of totalitarianism, but it does offer a number of different, what she calls elements or causal factors that lead to and make totalitarianism a possibility and obviously a reality in the 1930s and 40s in both Germany and in Soviet Russia. And one of those is what she calls loneliness, right? But loneliness doesn't just mean that you're alone. In fact, loneliness, you can be the most lonely when you're with other people. Loneliness for her is a sense of a loss of purpose and meaning in society. So she thinks that the world today is particularly prone to loneliness because of the loss of religion and the loss of traditions and the loss of a sense of family structures that had for generations and even thousands of years given people a sense of mission. Life is always hard, but I will go to heaven. Or life is always hard, but I'll be reincarnated. Or life is always hard, but I'm my family. I have my family. I have people that care about me. And there's this sense of abandonment that is sort of bubbling below the masses, the surface from masses of people in the modern world. And what Arendt says is that these people are prone, are craving meaning, craving feeling important. People want to feel important. They want to feel meaningful. And that the easiest way to motivate people like this is to tell them, well, if you just join this movement and get rid of bourgeoisie, in Soviet Russia, or get rid of Jews and other, vermin in Germany, or just hate blacks. If you just join this movement, you'll fight for a new utopia, a new Third Reich, a new Soviet International, a new world. And so for her, loneliness leads to a deep need to belong to a kind of ideological movement that gives certainty and clarity to people. And she says, writing the book, after the end of totalitarianism in Germany, and even after, she says, once Stalin is gone, this propensity to these kind of movements will continue in the modern world so long as these conditions that gave rise to it continue. And one of those is this kind of undergirding loneliness. Again, I'm not trying to be a namby-pamby two-sider, but, you're seeing around the world an illiberal right that is seeking to restore meaning through a kind of nationalistic, anti-immigrant, often racist discourse. And you're seeing what you call a woke left that is providing a kind of meaning and sense by fighting for against that, but also for a kind of, I think, undefined new idea, which I don't really understand what it would be, but it's there. And I think that there is a grave danger on both sides of. I think both of these movements are what I would call proto-totalitarian, in the sense that they are movements that can't be totalitarian because they're not in control, but have totalitarian elements to them. And
they seek to exploit people's want for meaning.
They seek to exploit what?
They seek to exploit people's desire for meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And that requires a kind of radical simplification of reality, an exclusion of, and saying that anyone who doesn't see it the way we do is evil, not only wrong, but evil, and either racist or pinko or whatever words you want to use. And so we basically create simple little silos for people. And this is happening at the same time that the truly most evil and probably most productive medium ever invented to target and isolate individuals and foster hate has become rampant around the world, which is called Facebook. Facebook is simply the easiest and best way to demographically target groups of people. ideological lies, because you can basically advertise to them based on very granular opinion differences. And so Facebook is a monstrous engine for hateful, siloed, bubble thinking, and Twitter simply amplifies it to an elite level. But Facebook, so yeah, I mean, all of this is happening at the same time amidst the pandemic, as you said, and amidst real serious racial reckoning, overdue racial reckoning in the United States, and it's a very volatile situation.
So this is actually the thing that caught my attention about Jordan Peterson. I know we won't dwell too much on him, but there was the political thing that sort of caught everyone's attention. But he was really concerned about totalitarian movements. He spent a lot of time reading about Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And he, I'm not sure how much Arendt he read, but part of what he was interested in was being able to restore meaning to people's lives in this sort of psychological way, psychotherapeutic way. And that's also what caught the attention of pastor friend that we had a conversation with, Paul. He's had conversations with another academic named John Vervaeke about very much this thing called the meaning crisis. That's sort of what they've deemed it. With the rise of suicides, rise of drug overdoses, all those sort of things are sort of factors of the meaning crisis, including these proto-totalitarian movements. And I'm a religious person, and I go to a specific temple and all that sort of thing. And that seems to be a place where I can find meaning. But I know for a lot of people, it's not an area where they feel like they can find meaning. Sort of what Paul and I talk about is getting people back into religious institutions to sort of restore meaning into their lives. But it doesn't seem like that's going to be enough, just because there's plenty of people who aren't comfortable enough with religion. And this isn't necessarily a question to you as an Arendt scholar, but just a question to you in general, Roger, and that is, how do people restore meaning to their lives?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think the loss of authority, and authority in Arendt's terminology, starts with a trinity of religion, nation, and family. But the loss of authority has left us quite adrift. Now, this can be seen as a negative because it can be seen as, oh my God, people are lonely and searching for meaning, and they're going to be attracted to whatever crazy ideology is served up to them. Arendt, also said, well, also there's an opportunity here. We are the first people living in a world, really not the first, but there are eras of authority, probably eras of lesser authority, but we're one of the first generations to live, it seems, with almost no authority. It's almost impossible to establish any authority today. And I mean, yeah, you could have a small authority here, in your church or in this place, but as a general matter, the idea that somehow there's going to be an agreement on some authority society-wide seems almost impossible. Is impossible, I would say. And her response to that is, we have to learn to live amidst that freedom. We have to learn to live and talk to each other. And it's in the talking. I mean, this is the argument I'm trying to make. It's part of why I signed the Harper's letter. It's part of what I said earlier. I do believe that in talking about justice with people we disagree with, absent any authority, absent any truth, that if we really do listen to each other and talk to each other, we will find that there's things we agree upon and there's things we disagree on, and we'll find enough that we agree on that we can live together. The problem The problem, Rajdeep, is that a lot of people say, I don't want to just find enough to agree on that we can live together. I want them to agree with me. And if they don't agree with me, they're evil people, and we should fire them or we should get rid of them. You can't have that attitude if you're going to try and live in a pluralistic world. And I do think that you're seeing that attitude going to extremes on both the right and the left. But I also believe that we're in a moment where, and this is why I think the Harper's letter was interesting. Yeah, we got criticized by a lot of people on the left. Yeah, some people on the right said, "Ha ha," they were arguing about cancel culture. We didn't mention cancel culture. We didn't mention the woke left. We were arguing against illiberalism on both the right and the left. But I think what was the most interesting is how many people came out of the woodwork to say thank you for saying it, thank you for writing this letter, thank you for signing it. Because I think there's a lot of people who actually deeply believe we need to have these conversations. And they have to happen in a way that allows people to disagree. And that's the hope I take from it. And I believe that the more conversations we have, the better chances we have of actually developing a new sense of a foundation that will hold us together.
I think that's part of why that was part of our interest in starting the podcast too, is starting conversations and taking disparate people like Paul Vanderklay, DeRoy Murdoch, yourself, who come from different walks of life, starting conversations about various things. I think it's kind of funny to me because I've actually gotten chastised quite a bit and run into quite a bit of pushback. At most of the time it's at bars where there's a rule you're not supposed to talk politics at the bar. And I try to talk about these things. Some people love it and they take my phone number down. They're like, I want to talk about these things. I can't believe it. Other people are like, can you please shut up? Usually the bartender is like, hey, knock it off. I don't want to fight in here. But I do strongly agree with that if you can get past, especially that initial friction, sometimes people I'm very good friends with will almost be snapping at each other. And then when we get past that point of snapping, we do get to a genuine conversation. And that does sort of create, I don't know, it does create some sort of meaning between two people. If you know that you can get along well enough to talk about difficult things and disagree, you want to talk about it more. And then you might have 3 or 4 people. But I do have a little bit of a time constraint. I had one last thing I wanted to, if you wanted to do a little bit of a fun segment, I found one of Hannah Arendt's final exams from 1961 on her On Revolution class. So I was going to ask you a few questions, see if you could get them right.
Oh yeah, you're gonna put me on the spot, Ethan. Okay.
All right, so I'll just pick the more simple ones.
I hope you're gonna edit this out if I get them wrong.
I don't know. We'll give you the option to review afterwards. So, what is the origin of the word revolution, and how was the word originally used in political language?
Well, revolution just meant the revolution of the spheres and of the ages, and it was sort of the fact that things come back to their beginnings. For her, revolution is often not about, it is the breaking out of something new, but it's also a return to the origin of the beginning, to the principles of the beginning. So it's revolving back in a circular back to the beginning.
Also, I don't know if I'm qualified to tell you if you're right or wrong, because this was Arendt's exam, so I don't want to, but I think that's generally, I looked it up as far as, like, that seems to be generally what she was getting at. Can you identify these dates? The 9th of Thermidor.
Oh, the 9th of Thermidor. I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, it may be the day Robespierre was
Yep.
That's my
guess.
That
was it. That was Robespierre. And then the 18th of Brumaire.
Well, the 18th Brumaire. I should know that. Marx wrote the 18th Brumaire. I forget what it was.
So that was when there's a little bit of ambiguity, but apparently that's when Napoleon first took over, the first Napoleon, and then Marx was comparing, I think, the third Napoleon's takeover to the first. And let me ask you one more. This was one I couldn't find an answer to specifically. I'm sure she must have mentioned in the class, but she says, what author had the greatest influence on the men of the French Revolution?
Oh, well, that would be Rousseau.
Rousseau?
Yeah.
I saw Rousseau and Montesquieu both came up, and then several said Marat.
Montesquieu, she thinks, was influential on the American Revolution, Rousseau on the French Revolution. For her, Rousseau had a negative influence on the French Revolution insofar as the line she really, and not only her, but many people object to in Rousseau, is that we must force them to be free. In her mind, Rousseau, for the French revolutionaries, Rousseau stood for this idea that we need to provide for people, for their needs, and if people resist what we need to do to make it, we must force them to be free. Whereas for the Americans, they had a much more, they had a deeper idea of politics, which is that we don't know what the end of the revolution is going to be, the goal of it. It's a process where we figure it out through Republican Democratic engagement and political activism.
All right, well, it seems like you would have passed the exam. I think that there's another question of give the English equivalent of monarchy, oligarchy, aristocracy. I think you'd find that pretty simple.
Well, that's presidency and the legislature and the judiciary.
So we have one final question we're going to ask all of our guests before the election, and that's, who was your prediction, Trump or Biden? Or will there be widespread chaos, delayed election?
You're asking for predictions? I'm not a prognosticator. I have.
This is what Raj said you would say.
In my lifetime. I will say this. I think that there's a very good chance that either side, whichever side wins, first of all, we may not know for a few days, which will lead to incredible anxiety. But I think whichever side loses, there will be people on that side that don't accept the result. Whether that will lead to protests or violence, I don't know. But I do find myself, somewhat concerned. But as a wise person I heard talk today said, I got enough problems today to worry about. 3 months down the road, Ethan and Rajdeep, and my hope is that, and I think there's not an insignificant chance that this is a blowout election, and that the country repudiates what, in my mind, is one of the most dangerous and heinous presidents we've ever had, and that there's no, and that it becomes an unambiguous repudiation of that kind of politics, and that as a result, we don't run into these kind of problems. But I don't have great faith in my predictive capacities.
Yeah, that's totally fair. That was Rajdeep predicted that would be your prediction. That you would not want to make it strong. I'll go out and say I think that Biden's going to win, and it's, when the results come out, it's going to look closer to the Obama electoral map than anything in recent memory. But I think that was, I don't know about what you guys thought. I had a good conversation. I thought that was illuminating. We got to talk about some more deep Arendt stuff, get your perspective, which is always great to hear on Arendt. So yeah, I think, unless either of you have anything to say, I think that wrap it up there.
Thanks for your time, Roger.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you both. Great to see two former students out engaging in the world. I really appreciate it, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll
Take care.
talk to you again soon.
Yep.
Who's to say more than our eyes for to see within the heart of one the sun we saw before? The moon is just a goon, yet soon the curtain falls. The savior in ourselves will crumble the walls. I know it seems a bit like we came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited, saw the alien, okay. Chalk it up to destiny, the rest of me's you. Like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The dead endeavor, the happiest rabbit ever within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Till the radio and television do tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. Can you break the arcade game before the flash that makes the dark star crash in the grass? I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November